Welcome to another IDE seminar. Our guest this week is Andrea Eisfeldt, who has requested that we try to have something as close to an in-person seminar as possible. The only thing we can't really do is lunch virtually. We haven't figured that technology out yet. Aside from that, though, Andrea would love if we would leave our video on, actually. Please mute yourself, but feel free to leave video on. And if you have questions, just let it rip. Unmute yourself, ask away, raise your hand if you'd like to be a little bit more polite, but I guess that's not necessary. We're gonna have a free-flowing discussion if all goes well. And I think our topic lends itself to a lot of discussion because it's top of mind for basically everybody these days. Andrea and her colleagues, I think, did some of the first quantitative work in finance to understand how the market is thinking about generative AI, especially around the announcement of ChatGPT out into the world. So I can't wait to see, to hear about the work and see the results. Andrea, over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. So I'm going to talk about, please feel free to interrupt anytime. I'll also try to leave time for questions at the end. I'm going to talk about the labor impact of generative AI on firm values, or in general, the impact of generative AI on firm values. And we're going to really uncover this labor channel. This is joint work with Gregor Schubert, Bloody Tasca, and Ben Zhang. So I probably don't need to motivate this too much, but ChatGPT and generative AI certainly made headlines when GPT was released. And these headlines were everywhere in the financial press, and firms like McKinsey were forecasting a huge amount of value added for firms, but without understanding the exposure of firms to this GPT technology and the exposure of workers, it is hard to put a number on this. And so this paper is really focused on what are the consequences for ChatGPT on firms and workers. So there are two potential channels for benefits to firms. The first, which is our focus, is from productivity improvements from incorporating AI. It's a generative transformer technology, but it is also a general purpose technology that's likely to affect all workers to some degree. And it affects a broad range of companies. And we're going to talk about which ones are impacted more. To improve productivity, generative AI can either be a substitute or complementary to labor. So I think this is something we've all been thinking about. And Gregor and I have actually been working on, subsequent to this paper, a review article entitled Generative AI in Finance that looks into how generative AI can be used in financial research and how it can be used to make corporate finance or asset management decisions. And I think our goal is to help to ensure that this technology is a complement to those of us in research and education. So the second channel that generative AI can benefit firms would be directly through product demand. And we know this is important because we saw the increase in the value of firms like NVIDIA, Microsoft, other chip makers like AMD. Also, those value increases coming around that release of GPT on November 30th of 2022. So it's going to be important for us when we look to uncover the impact of generative AI as a general purpose technology, that we try to disentangle this productivity improvement that would come through a labor channel from direct impact through a product market channel. So we want to argue that this general purpose technology shock is a broader phenomenon that's going to impact all firms to some extent in all industries, whereas the product demand component is going to affect a smaller number of companies in a smaller number of industries. So I want to give you just a little preview of our results, and I'm going to go into more detail as we go on. But this graph shows you the release of GPT on November 30th, 2022. That's where the dotted red drop line is. And the subsequent returns to two different portfolios and then a long short portfolio that goes long one and then short the other. The two portfolios are the A portfolio, the artificial portfolio, and the human portfolio, which is the H portfolio, the A portfolio being in red and the H portfolio in green. And those, the artificial and human portfolios, represent the highest quintile of generative AI exposure in the artificial portfolio, the red line, and the lowest quintile of exposure in the human portfolio with the dotted green line. The blue line then is an AMH portfolio. It's one of those, if you're in finance, you've seen a lot of portfolios, long short portfolios with cute 3-letter acronyms. I like this one. I like the artificial minus human portfolio. You can see that it increases in value a lot following the release of GPT. The market was actually down during the 2 weeks following the release of ChatGPT. And the green line kind of shows that this low exposure portfolio is looking a bit like the rest of the market. It is having a decrease in value, where the red portfolio, the artificial portfolio, actually increases in value by about 40 basis points a day over those 2 weeks. So it's a big difference. And when you take the returns to the long short portfolio, you can see that big increase in value during those 2 weeks in particular following the release of GPT. I want to emphasize that unlike other 3-letter acronym portfolios you might be familiar with, like a value portfolio, HML, or a size portfolio, SMB, this AMH portfolio here is capturing, we argue, a cash flow effect. So it is a difference in the change in the expected future cash flows of firms that have a high generative AI exposure versus those that have a low generative AI exposure. And now, just in terms of the x-axis, the reason we take it out through March 31st of 2023, you can see GPT-4 was released. It actually was released in early March. We can't use that. We essentially are going to be doing kind of a difference in differences event study, where we look at the different changes in value of firms that are more and less exposed to the technology. That later event, you can see the divergence in the A and H portfolios and the increase in the long short portfolio in the blue line. But that event was widely anticipated. The exact date wasn't known early March, but certainly by mid-February, end of February, everyone was kind of predicting it was going to happen any day now. But you certainly see that you get that change in value during that time too. Okay, so let me turn to measurement, because I want to tell you how that graph was constructed. We're going to do this in 3 steps. So we're going to start with task level measurement, then we're going to build up to occupations, and then from occupations, we're going to build up to firms. So if you think about the US labor force, there are about 900 occupations that make up the US labor force, and the firm's workforces are portfolios of workers in these different occupations. The occupations themselves are each comprised by something like 15 to 20 tasks. So in total, there are about 19,000 tasks that make up these 900 occupations that then comprise firms' workforces. So we're going to start at the task level, build up to occupations, and then build up to firms. And that build up to firms is really important, because without that market price, we can't see the valuation impact of this technology shock. Okay, so we're going to start at the task level. We're using the ONET data, which details those 19,000 tasks for 923 occupations. And what we're going to do is we're going to ask GPT to score worker tasks for exposure to generative AI. What we're going to do is we're going to submit a scoring rubric. We're going to give 2 examples, and we're going to give an occupation statement pair to the GPT 3.5 model, Turbo API. That model is going to return a score and an explanation for the scoring. This measurement at the task level and at the occupation level is going to follow prior work by Elundu et al. And our contribution is really going to be in building this up to the firm level, first of all, and then doing something that that we haven't seen done before, but is available in the ONET database, which is to look at the difference between core tasks and supplemental tasks. So I'm going to come back to this towards the end of the talk, but there are going to be turn out to be differences in terms of core and supplementary tasks being exposed and the effects on workers and firm values. So the scoring is going to be very simple. And those of you who work with these models, and this is something that we outline in Gregor and I in our AI in finance paper, it's really important when you're using GPT-like models as a research assistant to really think of them like a research assistant and give them detailed instructions and be careful about what you're asking to do. So GPT may not be good at giving numerical scores like, how exposed is this task to generative AI between 1 and 10, because that scale is not very well defined for the model, and it might not even apply that scale in the same way across 2 different tasks. So I think this design, which comes from the Elundu paper, is a very well thought out one, in that it has just these 3 categories. They're very clear categories. The exposure is going to be 0 if there's just no exposure, meaning that GPT cannot do the task at all. 1 is going to be that GPT can do the task 50% faster and with equal quality, and that's already feasible using GPT 3.5, the model released with that to a lot of fanfare at the end of November in 2022. And then a score of 0.5 is going to be 50% time saving equal quality, but requiring overlays. So you want to think about this half score as GPT can really do this task, but if it requires some proprietary data or some additional software training, that's going to give you a score of 0.5. From there, we're going to build up to occupations just by looking at an average exposure of the occupations tasks. So I'll give you some examples. These are, examples of each of the scores that are possible, and tasks that get those scores. So if we look at telemarketers, that's an occupation. One of their tasks is to adjust sales scripts to better target the needs and interests of specific individuals. That gets a score of 1. The reason being the model can learn from the sales scripts and the needs and interests of specific individuals to adjust sales scripts. So this is going to be something that has a 1 exposure because GPT can already do it 50% faster at equal quality. Same thing for the task of web developers, that is writing supporting code for web applications or websites. And we all know that GPT is very good at coding applications. Now, a score of 0.5, I mentioned proprietary data. So with paralegals and legal assistants, we've seen a lot of kind of speculation about what will happen at the lower levels at law firms and investment banks in terms of analysts and paralegals and things like that. And here you can see that the investigating facts and law of cases and search pertinent sources such as public records to determine cause of action and prepare cases gets a score of 0.5 because the model can assist in searching, but it may not be able to retrieve up-to-date facts, and that could require some additional software.
Hey, Andrea,
Yeah, please.
just to, because I know what it's like to present and you want people to ask questions. So I'm going to
Yes,
go off your lead. So
great.
it seems like a lot of your measure is somewhat like backward looking in that like we're thinking about the capabilities of GPT 3.5 in terms of some of these tasks. But you could imagine that people are pricing not just what existing models can do, but what we might expect that the models will soon be able to do. So for example, 3.5 does not have the capability to search the web, but then Perplexity became quite, popular, same with Search GPT. Have you thought about like how you might update the measure when we're really thinking about exposure in the broad sense of like, in a world as these where these models are continuing to develop?
Yeah, I think that is a good point. So to the extent that the exposure from future models is very different from the exposure to 3.5. So I think you brought up like a case where it is different. So I think um getting this web search is something that newer models can do. There are other, when we look at what the exposure measures are going to tell us, there's a distinct difference between, I think, things that 3.5 could do at equal quality and 50% faster, that future improvements of the models are sort of just, probably even better and faster. So it's kind of just a larger impact, but kind of the same idea. To the extent that, a 0.5 means something really different with current models. And I think you did bring up a good example of that. The precise question would have to be designed um for the model that you were thinking about. I do agree with that. So what we have is really what the market thought about the exposure to the current model, and to the extent that that exposure would be fairly well correlated with future models as well. So I think that that correlation is probably pretty high. I actually thought we thought about even dropping the 0.5 scoring, because um it makes it just that little bit more complicated, and I do think the ones are really important and the zeros are really important. However, I think because of your point, the point fives are actually useful. I think this could be done with zeros and ones, but I think the results are more accurate with the 0.5s. And it's possible that that's precisely because the point five is capturing what the model can potentially do in the future. It's an interesting point.
Well, one suggestion, I mean, this paper is going to, I think, have enormous impact as people use your measure. I think it might be even just useful for you to either have on your website or an appendix, sort of the evolution, like sort of the persistence of these scores for the same level of tasks across different model iterations, just to get some sense of the stability. But I don't think it undermines in any way what you're doing. It's just trying to sort of future-proof this for other research.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Um, I love that. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So, moving on to the zeros, and this will kind of give you an idea. When you look at the ones and you look at the zeros, I think it becomes really clear why I think a lot of the scores are going to be fairly persistent. So the kinds of things that get zeros have some physical work element to it. So for heating, air conditioning, and refrigeration mechanics, connecting heating or air conditioning to fuel, water, or refrigerant, it requires some manual labor. Same thing with physician assistants. They have to give immunizations, and that is something that an LLM is not going to be able to do. So um, I probably will skip over this slide that's, kind of um, specific to the kinds of things that we do. But you can see that, within our job, there are, which is business, teachers, post-secondary, there is the full range of tasks, things that GPT can do, like develop websites and course syllabi, and we've probably all utilized it this way, help with writing grants, etc. But for, grading and some things having to do with bibliographies, maybe it's going to need some additional information. And then all the interpersonal things that we do are not things that the model is going to be able to help with. So knowing that the scores are going to range between 0 and 1, and knowing that an occupation is going to be a portfolio of those tasks, the exposure at the occupation level is going to live between 0 and 1. So will be 1 if all the tasks of this occupation can be done by the model. And you can see that for telemarketers, you have this very high score of 0.96, and same thing for proofreaders and copy markers. And that score is really high even for mathematicians, computer programmers, word processors, et cetera. So these are the highest exposure occupations. And given what these models are capable of, and in particular what 3.5 was capable of, I think this is all very intuitive. If we go then to the lowest occupation exposures, 17% or 132 of 785 BLS occupations have 0 exposure. And this is just done alphabetically. So we get things like shampooers, tile and stone setters, and wellhead pumpers. But you can see that, these occupations involve a lot of physical tasks, and hence these occupations have 0 exposure to generative AI. And this is going to be a hint of the first way in which generative AI is actually a different technology shock to the automation waves that we have seen previously. So what we're going to do is highlight the ways in which this technology shock is different to and similar to those prior automation waves. So one way that it is, I showed you one way that it's similar in the sense that it is a technology shock that is going to have some automation of tasks, and it is going to ultimately have some sort of substitution effect with the kinds of occupations that it can perform the tasks for. But one way it's very different from prior automation waves is the type of tasks and types of occupations where the exposure is going to be high, and where we are going to see more of this automation, and ultimately we're going to provide some evidence of substitution effects. So this is the occupational exposure to generative AI technology and wages. And we have wages increasing on the x-axis and the generative AI exposure at the occupation level on the y-axis. And then these are occupational wages. You can see this positive relationship. So the higher the fraction of the tasks in your occupation that are exposed to generative AI, meaning the model can do your tasks, it turns out that the higher on average your wages are in terms of a correlational sense. So you can see that high exposure occupations like computer and mathematical, legal and management have also high wages, and low exposure occupations like food prep and serving, ground cleaning and maintenance, farming, fishing, forestry have both low wages and low exposure. So this is a way in which this technology shock is different from prior automation waves. Yeah, David, please.
Hi, thanks very much. So I guess I want to ask you, what exactly is different about this in the following sense? If we look at the last 50 years of automation, right, it certainly had very little effect on food prep and serving and grounds cleaning and maintenance. I think what many people have in mind is, well, it had a larger effect in the middle. Obviously, that's something I've written about. But, we all work in occupations that are 100% exposed to computers, right? And in fact, every professional, managerial, and technical worker is 100% exposed. So I think, it's just that we think of that as exposure as a positive, not as a negative. So I think what it's not really exposure that's different unless you mean exposure in the sense of substitution. And maybe that's exactly what you mean. But then where would complementarity enter, or how would we even know?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's something that I'm going to get to later in the talk. And I think that you're right to push me on that in terms of the difference between, being exposed to computers. So I was on a panel at the AFA, and Steve Kaplan was the moderator, and we were talking about finance. So we talked about the similarities between generative AI and Excel. And then I was just having brunch with my kids, and on the TV at the restaurant, there was the Excel championships. And my kids were like, what is that? That is crazy. And it kind of is crazy, but there is this sense in which, Excel came and we thought, well, we don't need all these like human calculators anymore. We can do spreadsheets. And it did turn out to be complementary to some people. I'm going to show you evidence that this technology turns out to appear to be mainly a substitute in terms of the initial effects on hiring and wages for the more exposed occupations. And that's kind of consistent with, the layoffs that we saw at a lot of tech firms. So that may be the difference, potentially more than some of the exposures. I think I had in mind, and please, because you are the expert here, I think I had in mind automation waves that people had thought about in manufacturing. That this being kind of distinct from that in terms of, we don't have Laverne and Shirley putting bottles on, caps on bottles or whatever that was, if I recall correctly. Sanjeev, go ahead.
I appreciate the Laverne and Shirley reference, by the way. I don't know if everyone in this call does, but I do.
Fantastic.
I just had a quick comment. Is it the assumption that all the application and the effect that you've looked at, it's all Gen AI to a software, but not Gen AI to a hardware? Because as soon as the Gen AI and the evolution of where the investments are in the hardware, all the ones where on the left-hand side here, roles are going to be impacted, and the value would grow for, I mean, think of farming or medication or research where robots or anyone else is doing that work and Gen AI is being applied there. So is it correct that the old assumption on this model is all around just Gen AI to a software application and not to hardware?
That's a great question. I think it is more of a software effect because of the question, the exposure that we're measuring. It is, can generative AI do these tasks? So I think that the effects that you're thinking of are going to be outside of what we are currently measuring. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So, okay, great. Okay, so let me actually, since we have David in the audience, the very next thing that we do is to look at the relationship between the occupational exposure to generative AI. And we're saying that it's different from automation in this sense. And correct me if I'm misinterpreting this. Is a great chance to kind of level set this analysis. But basically, we're looking at just the correlation, the regression relationship between our exposure measure and the occupational skill scores from your work with Acemoglu. And you can see that the standardized coefficients that are plotted along the x-axis and the skill measures on the y-axis, that the exposures are higher for the non-routine cognitive analytical, the routine cognitive, and then the lowest for the non-routine manual physical, as well as the routine manual. So I was thinking of prior automation waves mainly affecting routine manual work. And so we'll think about the extent to which some waves affected the routine manual work, and other technology waves like the IT revolution of the 90s did affect some of the cognitive things that we have at the beginning. And I agree with that. And, we all, for those of us who teach in a business school, I think we're aware of what the effects of that prior IT revolution may have been on things like middle management and management generally. So it's a great point. Okay, so when I say different from automation, I'm really thinking about the automation of more routine manual tasks. Okay, so now we want to build up to the firm level. we're going to be using LinkedIn profiles from Revelio Labs that has firm employment by occupation. And this is, very simple. We went from tasks to occupations. Now we're going to go from occupations to firms, where the firm exposure is just going to be the employment share of that occupation at that firm times the exposure of that occupation. So when we go ahead and do that, I'm going to look just to the largest firms, because that means that you guys are going to recognize the names of the firms. So these are the top 15 out of, the largest 100 companies. These are the firms with the highest exposure to generative AI. And you see IBM at the top. IBM was in headlines for the effects of generative AI and their decisions about employment at their firm. So it makes sense that it's up there at the top. You also see communications firms like S&P Global, and you see software firms like Adobe. In addition to that, you see NVIDIA here. And so it's going to be important for us to control for that product demand that clearly can be driving some of the positive impacts on firm value from the introduction of GPT. In terms of those large firms with lower exposure, we have things like Starbucks, McDonald's, Home Depot, and I think these all make a lot of sense. Tesla is also here. It's on the higher end of the lower exposure. And, as much as some of us would like to class Tesla as a software firm, at the end of the day, the workforce has a large manufacturing component, and that's where that's coming in. Okay, so now let's look at the impact on firm values from firm exposure. First thing I want to do, in some sense, we are testing a joint hypothesis. We're testing the hypothesis that there is an impact through labor force exposure to GPT on firm values, and that the market is going to be able to figure this out. So we have in the paper some information on earnings calls and analyst forecasts and things like that. Here, I'm just going to show you the Twitter mentions. You can see that starting on November 30th, you have a huge spike in Twitter mentions that remains elevated for some time, and certainly for the 2-week window that we're going to be focusing on here. This is the earnings calls references. You can see the spike up at the end, and then we have some more data in the paper. And the more exposed firms communicate more about generative AI. Okay, so let's go then. Now, taking on board the idea that the market was certainly paying attention to this and trying to sort out the impact of this important news on firm valuations, let's see what we find when we look at the differences in the values of the firms that have a high and a low exposure. So we're basically just going to sort stocks by generative exposure, generative AI exposure quintiles. We're going to form a long short portfolio that compares the stock returns of the high versus low exposure firms during the 2 weeks following the GPT release. Now, whenever you do an event study, you need to have enough time for the market to digest the information. This is fairly complex information, but you don't want to have so long a window that you have confounding information entering. So we chose 2 weeks, making that trade-off, and we have robustness results in the appendix of the paper using 1 week, and find some things that are very similar. So we'll focus on this 2-week window for the purposes of the talk. And we're going to look at the returns to the high exposure portfolio, which is we put things in quintiles. So there are 5 portfolios minus the human portfolio, which is the lowest exposure quintile. And we find that this AMH portfolio returned 40 basis points daily during the 2 weeks after the GPT release. Now, this is a huge change in value, 40%, 40 basis points daily. And the overall market return was negative over these 2 weeks. So if you kind of think back to what was happening, we had increases in interest rates around that time, and overall the market was negative. The differences in the returns to this portfolio are also insignificant during the rest of the sample, which is important for, ruling out that there's something else driving the divergence in the change in values. So this is a longer time series of the graph that I showed you at the beginning. Again, the artificial portfolio in red, the human portfolio in green, the AMH portfolio in blue. The reason I wanted to show this is because you can see that there's a distinct change in these portfolios at the time of the event. There's nothing going on in the pre-period, and then the post-period is very consistent with something being driven by this exposure that we're measuring, a distinct difference between the behavior of the artificial in red and the human in green. So, okay, we have a lot of robustness checks. We do things like controlling for known risk factors, the FAMA French 5, that can bring our differences in returns to, or the returns to the AMH portfolio down to 35 basis points. If we exclude the tech sector, which is our first way of controlling for product market exposure, we get 38 basis points. So this is, evidence that this is not just product exposure and that this is a technology shock that is really occurring across a broad array of industries. And then we also do a sort within industries, so controlling for the average industry effect, and we still find 30 basis points using Nike's 3-digit industries. So moving to more specific product market exposure controls. So we did excluding the tech sector, we did sorting within industries, and we did controlling for risk factors that might be correlated with industry. We're going to use 4 different measures of product market exposures. The first is going to be a 10K based measure of AI product demand. And then we're going to use 10K mentions of data. It turns out that there was a Goldman Sachs paper, kind of a white paper that was published a month or 2 after our work, sort of bears some similarity, and has an ex post list of exposures to generative AI. We'll use that. And then we'll use the AI Skillshare from Babina, Fedek, Hay, and Hodson, which is another labor-based measure, this Skillshare measure. Okay, so now if we include these product market exposure measures, and we have the 4 different measures. So if you look across the columns, the first column, note we're doing this within industries. So that's why we're starting with the sort of around 30 basis point exposure, because all of these are within industry measures, because we have the industry fixed effects. You can see that the individual product measures themselves do seem to capture something about positive impact on firm value from product market exposure to generative AI. However, once we include our labor market exposure, none of those product market exposure measures are significant, and our labor market exposure measure, which does decrease in economic and statistical significance, but it is still statistically significant and retains a high level of economic significance as well. So this is the sense in which we think that our labor market exposure measure is distinct from a product market exposure measure, and also capturing something that is robust to trying to control for those product market exposures. The next question that we're going to ask is so one of the things that comes up when you think about the firm level exposure to generative AI is we think this is a technological revolution. We think that it's going to change firm values. It's not exactly clear why this would be something that would benefit incumbent firms versus, lead to some creative destruction, and maybe it's new firms and new entrants that would benefit. And here the idea was that, well, there's an asset in place that's complementary to generative AI, and it's something that incumbent firms have, and that it would be a challenge for new entrants to create. So we're going to use some measures. This asset is data, and we're going to use some measures of data assets at the firm level to try to convince you that one of the reasons that we might see incumbent firms benefiting from generative AI technology improvements is because they have these data assets. So, we saw things like, again, McKinsey saying if your data isn't ready for generative AI, your business isn't ready. And I didn't present the results for different industries and the effects of exposure within industries. In most industries, having higher exposure is positive for firm value, but there are industries in which it is negative. And one of those industries, interestingly, for those of us who work in the real estate space, was in real estate and leasing applications. And if you have any experience with real estate data, you know that a lot of it is disaggregated. It's at the county level. Some of it is still on paper. And it really fits into this idea that the data is not ready for generative AI. And I think that those are the industries where you would see potentially disruption. And that was one industry where higher exposure was actually a negative for firm value. Okay, so we know that the generative AI models need data. So let's talk about, I'm going to focus on two ways to measure data assets. The first is going to be a 10K measure, which is look at the 10K to see if the business description suggests access to data is relevant for generative AI analytics based on the mention of 6 topics. And then we're going to ask for these scores: no, little, moderate, or high. And then the second measure is going to be the ABIS and Veldkamp data assets measure. And this is actually, this is my preferred measure because it's based on this very nice paper, which looks at the share of roles that tend to require a high level of data management skills in the firm's employment structure. And so the idea is that data managers are a proxy for valuable data to be managed. And I think that makes a lot of sense. We're going to find that higher firm values due to generative AI are by and large driven by firms with more data assets. So we're going to be looking at something similar to what we were before, which is the cumulative abnormal returns. We're going to, in addition to looking at the exposure, the labor exposure directly, we're going to interact that exposure with data assets using these 2 measures. Again, we're going to be looking sort of within industries or controlling for industry fixed effects. And what you see is when you look at the interaction term, it's large, it's positive, it's statistically significant, and you see that the exposure not interacted, once we include this interaction term, is really just basically insignificant. So this evidence, and I think, Eric, you had mentioned there are students looking into this. I think this is an area that really deserves deeper investigation, because we're not only finding that the higher labor exposure leads to an increase in firm value, but that increase comes for firms that have valuable data assets based on these 2 measures. And I think we have a couple others in the paper. Okay, so I want to talk about the impact on labor specifically, and speak to this question to the extent I can about substitutability versus complementarity. So, I'm going to skip the CEO survey. Many CEOs understand that this is going to change their labor demand. So, this increase in firm value through a labor channel can come in 2 ways. At least it can substitute for workers, meaning that I can have more generative AI and fewer workers, or pay existing workers less. So the labor share might be expected to decline at these firms with high exposure. Or it could be a complement. Generative AI can be used by the worker to increase productivity, and we would see higher labor demand and wages. So having worked on changes in the labor share, in particular, the effect of equity pay on changes in labor share, these kinds of, the estimates of complementarity or elasticity of substitution parameters are typically done using, long time series or changes in steady states in factor shares. So that's not something we're going to be able to do here. What we're going to do is, and when you think about this complementarity, I mean, this is what we hope to be, is it's that, generative AI is an engine and we want to be the engine drivers. We don't want to be, the horses get displaced by automobiles. So we're going to distinguish here the impact for tasks in which the task, we're just going to look back to the task level. And again, this is something that's in the ONET data. We haven't seen it used before. ONET classifies each task within an occupation as a core task, which means that that task is crucial or critical key for performing the function in the occupation, and a supplemental task, which is essentially the complement of being a core task. So we have these tasks that are really, the critical tasks within an occupation, and then we have supplemental tasks, which are the rest of the tasks that are make up the occupation. So our hypothesis is that if the task is a core task, then it is more like, and generative AI can execute the core task in that occupation, then it's more likely that the model is going to be a substitute, in the sense that we should see lower hiring and lower wages. And if the task is a supplemental task, or the majority of the tasks in the occupation that are exposed to generative AI are supplemental, then there's more potential for complementarity. Okay, so we're going to be measuring the share of the tasks. We're going to measure the supplemental share exposure by basically summing over supplemental tasks, their exposures, and then dividing by the total number of tasks exposures.
Andrea, can you go
Yeah.
back to the prior slide?
This one?
Oh, no, sorry. You're just the prior.
This one.
Yes, this slide.
Yep.
So I think it's useful to be thinking about this measure at the firm level versus the individual level, in the sense that I suspect what may happen for these core supplemental tasks is people can now move away from some of these supplemental things we previously outsourced, and simply can do more of the core tasks for which AI cannot, it currently cannot do. So when you're thinking about whether it's complementary or substitutive, I suspect you just need fewer people who can do that core task, but do it at scale because they don't have these other sorts of things to focus on. And so I think it's an important distinction if you really mean complementing at the firm level, or if you mean at the worker level, because you could have one productive worker now who can do many more tasks, and I simply cut the rest or don't hire others.
Yeah, so we are thinking about it at the worker level. We're thinking about whether the firm and whether within that occupation you will see higher or lower wages, and more or less hiring. What you're bringing up, I think, is a very interesting question, and this is a debate that I have with one of my co-authors on other work, which is, do we expect generative AI? What do we expect it to do to the wage distribution within an occupation? Do we think this is going to be a flattener, in the sense that, we can all code now? Or do we think it's going to be, I think, more similar to other technologies like Excel, where you get this superstar effect, which is the people who are really good at this now can basically do the job of, 10 people. And, we get this hollowing out of the middle of some of those occupations. But here, let me show you what I have, and then you'll see. I think this is actually a really complex question, the idea of complementarity versus substitution, and especially trying to do this over a short time period. So let me show you what we have. So here, what you're going to see is what we're looking at here is hiring. We're going to test for a change in job postings, and then we're going to also look at profitability in this one. And you're going to see that the post times generative AI exposure is going to be negative in terms of hiring measured by job postings, but that this is mainly driven by the core task exposures. So the post times share times exposure times share supplement is actually going to be positive. So I think what we can take away from this is that when the exposure comes through core task exposure, there is a reduction in job postings within that occupation. If the exposure is to supplementary tasks, then there is a smaller decline or potentially even an increase in those job postings. For profitability, you can see that the increase in profitability is also coming from the core task exposures of the occupations within firms. So if we look just at the post times generative AI exposure increase in gross profitability, we see it's positive, but once we control for the fact that some of that exposure comes from supplemental tasks, we get an even more positive coefficient by removing the less positive effects of having your supplemental tasks exposed. And that would be consistent with profitability going up because you can substitute away labor that has high core task exposure. But potentially, if you have a lot of supplementary task exposure, you might even want to increase wages or hire more workers. Charles, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, a lot of these investments, in order to capture these productivity gains, firms sort of need to make experiments and figure out what works in order to actually augment their labor force. Do you examine sort of like the time series of how this occurs, and also whether there's like a demand substitution away from the traditional definition of the task and sort of towards someone who might be able to code up a generative AI solution for that task, for example?
Okay, so bearing in mind that, you know, we still don't have a very long time series, and these are macro outcomes that don't have a high frequency of release either. So I think those questions are still a little bit hard to answer. We do, in the summary paper that I mentioned, we do look at hiring within job titles that include like ML, AI, that kind of programming. And I do think that, and we see a big increase in that kind of skill demand, I think not surprisingly. I think over time, we'll be able better position to answer the kinds of questions that you have. So I'm going to say that we probably don't have a lot of power to answer those questions now. An interesting question, and you know, I think this is also challenging within the data that we have, but there are other sources for occupations and tasks that may be more dynamic than ONET. Like I'm gonna forget there's some commercial databases that have that. I think this idea that the tasks themselves are going to change. Like we went from, you know, needing people that were good with you know, database, Lotus, whatever it was before Excel, to people who were better with Excel. I think you're right that the tasks within these occupations, if you're a telemarketer, maybe you don't need so much to be on the phone, but you need to be coding up prompts and writing software. I think that's right. So just to be conscious of time, can someone let me know, do I end on time? Started 5 minutes late, but end on time? Is that the idea? So I'm sorry that I didn't leave much time for questions in that case. Okay, so it looks like, yes, I will end on time.
Oh, feel free to take a few extra questions if you want.
Okay, so I'll try to end on time and then take questions. So so the returns are also higher when the exposure comes more from core tasks. And the wages and hiring have declined more for more exposed occupations. So if Gen AI exposure affects your core tasks, the hiring impact is more negative and the wages decline more. So I think at this point, we have some evidence that at least through core task exposure, the impact of generative AI, the reason for one of the channels for the change in firm value, the increase in profitability is the increase in profitability at firms. We've now backed that up with changes in analyst forecasts of earnings, so the market was aware of these increase in profits at the time of the release, is coming from core task exposure and some substitution in terms of less hiring and lower wages for occupations that have higher core task exposures, and at firms with more occupations with higher core task exposures. So let me summarize and then answer any existing outstanding questions. We have this large technological shock. There's an immediate positive impact on the value of exposed firms. The labor channel of generative AI exposure, higher exposure is correlated with higher returns. Firms with more exposure reduce hiring for exposed jobs. They increase in profitability. The profitability hiring effects are greater if the exposure is driven by the core tasks. The importance of data assets for realizing the value of generative AI leads to heterogeneity across firms. And there's a higher impact for white-collar jobs that are high-skilled, high-wage occupations. And the short-run impact on exposed workers is negative on average. But it does depend on which tasks are exposed to generative AI. So I think that's kind of the little bit of good news, is that if it's your supplemental tasks that are exposed, there is more room in what we've found for believing that this technology is going to be complementary. We think that there are really important policy implications, winners and losers from the technology, both among firms. So which firms you own it will change how you benefit from the improved technology, and then across workers as well. So there's a very big heterogeneous impact coming through this labor channel on both capital owners and labor owners. And so let me end there. I'm going to stop sharing so that we can chat about any questions. Hung, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for that talk. It was very thought-provoking. I had a question about data construction. So you mentioned that you're doing like an event study around those 2 weeks after the release of ChatGPT, but you have a lot of sort of like slower moving data series, like the Revalue data and potentially, the Alondu measurement using, I don't know if this is using ONET from like 2019 or 2024. So how do you sort of reconcile these different timings? Because you wouldn't want to have like 2024 predictions of what's exposed to then apply backwards to that event study period, right? Because then you would see some sort of like contamination of the data labeling.
Yeah, that's right. I think, I mean, we certainly wouldn't want to use a measure from the future and then go back. I completely agree with that. Now, you say those variables are slow moving in terms of the data release. I think they're also slow moving because they are kind of more like stock variables. So working a lot with finance and kind of there's a huge difference between market values and book values and all the kind of other slow moving things. I mean, yes, we want to have as up-to-date information in terms of the tasks within occupations, and then the composition of the firm's workforce. We did the best we could with getting the most contemporaneous data that we have. But again, those things are fairly slow moving, like the turnover rates for those kinds of things, I think are very, very low.
Because I guess in terms of value data, I was wondering if you already had resume data that reflected the layouts of 2022, 2023 in the Revalue data by the time you use the data set, or it was like
we do have some firm level information on not only job postings. That is a good question. I would have to look back at the paper. I apologize for that, to see if we already have the resume differences in terms of the portfolio of the occupations of those firms.
Mm-hmm. I see. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Sinan, please.
Andrea, thank you. This was fascinating. I wonder if you can comment, and you mentioned briefly about complementarity and detecting complementarity being complex. If you can talk a little bit about your views, even though you may not have data here, about output and quality adjusted output, and whether this may be what we're witnessing in this data is a rush by managers to a local optimum, that substitution may provide profitability in the short term because Gen AI can substitute a core task, but that worker whose share of the core task is high, plus a machine, can produce quality adjusted output that's even greater than either the worker or the machine. And what does that mean in terms of, when I think about complementarity, I think about the output equations. Firm value is a good proxy for that, obviously, but there are other ways. And we've got, I suppose, investors also have a high degree of uncertainty about what the optimum use of this technology is. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that broader complexity of the complementarity question, and specifically about output and quality adjusted output.
Okay, yeah. So let me say this. So first, to avoid speculation, the way I think about substitution and complementarity is in the context of a specific theoretically based measurement exercise. So the exercises that I've done, kind of very consistent with others, is using a CES type technology, estimating elasticity of substitution parameters by comparing across different dates shares of value added of different inputs. So say high skilled labor, low skilled labor, and capital. So ideally, that's what I think I would be doing here, but I would need enough time to see those shares in value added changing. And you kind of want to aggregate across years, because you don't want to have like a lot of, year specific effects in those kind of measurement exercises. So given that I can't really do that, I think you're right to point out that, first of all, there may be a difference between what is locally in terms of time optimal and what would be, the long run best action. I am open to the idea that managers' horizon may be different from firm owners' horizons. We believe in agency problems, let's put it that way. That said, there are a lot of investments being made. It isn't not all of adopting generative AI is free. And I think, one of the things that didn't come up is, kind of where we really are in this life cycle, and what investments we have to make, both in terms of employee training and infrastructure, to achieve all those benefits that, either are already priced in or that we would see down the road. I think what ultimately happens, nothing is set in stone. Everything that we are measuring is market expectations at a given point in time. And, Lucas' critique looms large thereafter. Everything that happens thereafter is going to depend on all the changes in state variables like business cycle effects, regulatory effects, government spending effects. So I think it's very hard to say whether ultimately we will have greater complementarity effects than what we are measuring. But I'm hopeful that there will be a substantial amount of complementarity. And one of the things that I will kind of circle back to is that the effects that we are finding are about hiring for roles where the core tasks are very exposed. Again, there will be new tasks and new things to be done, and we are already seeing the increase in hiring there. So I definitely don't want to step away with a pessimistic view here. I do believe that there are reallocative effects from technology shocks, but that, the pie gets bigger, and that if we and there are ways of doing things better to make sure that the sharing of any gains and that increase in the size of the pie you know, kind of works out in a way that is welfare enhancing. Yeah, it's a really important question. And I think that and in that sense that managers of firms right now are in kind of an important position to determine not only the value of their firm for shareholders and earnings per share in the short run, but really the longevity of the way the technologies are going to be executed going forward. Yeah.
Andrea,
Yeah, go ahead, Eric.
Oh, just want to say thanks so much for taking time to join us. It was a real pleasure, treat to see your work, and we're looking forward to seeing more of the great work that you produce in this area.
Thank you so much.